Welcome to Injustice in the Justice System, a Google Hangout by the American Friends Service Committee. 18-year-old Mike Brown was shot to death by police officer Darren Wilson in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9, 2014. The tragedy has ignited a conversation nationally about racism and police brutality in communities of color. It's about time. We at AFSC runs programs that celebrate and support the humanity of young people like Mike Brown. We also work to change the underlying conditions that lead to injustice at every level of the justice system, including the school-to-prison pipeline that drives so many young men of color into the criminal justice system at an early age. Today we'll be discussing the current situation in Ferguson with Joshua Saleem, AFSC's Peace Education Director in St. Louis, and the struggle against the school-to-prison pipeline in New York with Lewis Webb, AFSC's project coordinator on the new Jim Crow project. We're going to start with Joshua, but please send your questions to questions@afsc.org. Let's start with Joshua. Joshua, what did you see in Ferguson yesterday? What's going on there?
Before I give an update on Ferguson, Alexis, I'd first like to talk about a little bit about what this tragedy has meant to me personally. You know, being here in St. Louis, I grew up about 4 miles away from Ferguson in another municipality just east of there called Moline Acres. I lived there until I was 10 years old. I have an aunt and uncle who still live in Ferguson. They've got 2 sons, and you know, I go visit them, you know, a couple times a year. And so, and in addition to that, for the past 2 years, as we've developed programming there at McClure High School in the Ferguson-Florissant School District, I've driven through Ferguson at least once a week during the school year. And so over the past 2 weeks, I mean, this tragedy hits me on a very personal level, you know, in addition to the fact that I've got a 2-year-old son who's got to grow up in these conditions and in this community. And so it's over the past 2 weeks, I've wondered, and the question has been going through my mind of you know, could this have been me? Have I seen Officer Wilson, you know, as I travel around in that community, and so yeah, this situation, this tragedy hits very close to home, and so over the past 2 weeks, there have been, you know, you've seen, and I'm sure you've seen in the media, conflicts with protesters and the police. My first contact on the ground was the Tuesday following the shooting. I went down, and the way that I take from my home to get there to the QT, I had heard that that was kind of the epicenter of what was going on and the center of activity. I have to pass through a strip mall or shopping mall, the Buzz Westfall Center, where there's this Target, there's 2 grocery stores, there's 3 fast food restaurants, and about a dozen other retail stores there on the way on West Florissant, the street that the Quick Trip is on. And I had to pass this, and if you can imagine, you know, a shopping mall, about a third of the parking lot was taped off and filled with police vehicles. There were SWAT teams. I pulled off and just to capture that moment, and there were helicopters flying in and out. There were, I mean, this was a real command control center. There were police in fatigues, and this was before the National Guard stepped in. So this was the local municipalities had gathered there, as well as the St. Louis County Police Department. There were SWAT vehicles. There were these tanks. Again, men in fatigues on top of those vehicles with their assault rifles, as if they were preparing for war. And this was, you know, two days after the shooting. And so, if you can, I mean, that was the kind of gearing up that was there in the community, in a Target parking lot, if you can imagine that. And so each night the protesters were met with this type of force. police in riot gear, prepared to dispense tear gas as they did. And I want to take a second to mention that unfortunately there were some elements that were destructive and that were looting. But again, for the vast majority of the folks that were gathered there in that community, they were involved in peaceful protests. And unfortunately, the media, those few people overshadowed the message that the community in Ferguson wanted to put out in terms of fighting for justice for Mike Brown. One thing that I haven't seen reported or didn't see reported enough of was the fact that during these demonstrations or after the demonstrations, folks were being trained in direct action nonviolence, nonviolent protest. And a week after the shooting, I participated in a march, and for an hour and a half following the march, we were trained, and there was about 100 people who were trained in direct action, or nonviolent direct action. And that's a story that I haven't heard in the media at all. And it was interesting during one of those questions after the training, during one of those question and answer periods about how do we deal with tear gas. Anna Baltzer, who's a local St. Louis and activist, she talked about some of the tips and gave us some tips that Palestinians have used in Gaza in terms of dealing with the tear gas that's thrown at them. And also throughout the week there were many more peaceful protests. I talked to one of the lead organizers who talked about the strategy being we want to take the focus and we want to take the heat away from Ferguson. So there have been a number of protests and demonstrations in downtown St. Louis, as well as the county seat in Clayton. And so it was at one of those demonstrations that I had a surreal moment when I saw, this was in downtown St. Louis, when I saw Hetty Epstein. She's this 90-year-old Holocaust survivor being taken away to the police van in these, in the plastic cuffs with the cane under her arm. It's just one of those surreal moments, but it just gives you a glimpse about how big this story has become and how many people these issues have touched. So last night I went down to Ferguson and just to see what was going on at around 9:30 in the evening, and I actually saw more media and more photographers there than residents or any protesters. The folks there were, I guess, really respecting, and I'm assuming that they respected the wishes of Mike Brown's family, that there wouldn't be any demonstrations or protests last night. And so that's kind of what's going on right now. There's been calm, but there's a demonstration going on right now. There's a march planned for this afternoon there in Ferguson. And so there's with a funeral that happened last night, I think the community is beginning to heal from what has gone on. They need to heal from the trauma of witnessing Mike Brown being shot and gunned down before their eyes. They need to heal from the trauma of seeing his body lay there for over 4 hours. They need to heal from the trauma of over about 2 weeks of having tear gas dispensed literally in their backyard.
Right.
And so,
Joshua, I'm going to interrupt you because I want to ask you about the youth, especially the youth in the peace education program you've worked with before. Ferguson is not the first time that young people in your program have dealt with injustice in the justice system and the lack of peace in the streets. Can you talk a little bit about the peace education program and what you've been doing and what you hope to do?
Sure. So the vision for the peace education program here is to transform schools and communities to peaceful and just environments by equipping young people with conflict resolution, civic engagement, and community organizing skills. So our work has primarily been focused in the schools, So we partnered with 3 schools the first year, 2 this past year, McClure and Northwest Academy of Law. Our entrance into the school is this basic conflict resolution training based on help increase the peace curriculum. But that's just the kind of entrance. We want to begin a conversation about community violence and how violence in our community is connected to larger societal injustice, things like poverty, racism, and economic inequality. And then we want to facilitate a process by which the young people will develop civic engagement projects that will address one of those root causes of violence in their community and in their neighborhood. And so that's what we've been doing for the past 2 years. In the wake of the Mike Brown tragedy, we've just been having listening sessions with the young people in the schools that we work with, so that they have an opportunity to vent and talk about how they're feeling at this moment. A lot of the folks there, the youth there on the street, down on the ground in Ferguson, have a lot of anger, and justifiable anger and frustration. And so we want to just listen at this moment and try to redirect that energy into organizing, so that they can actually do something about the systems that they're fed up with, and that the systems that led to the death of and killing of Mike Brown.
Thanks, Joshua. A couple of points to make there. Yesterday, according to news reports, dozens of colleges experienced walkouts by young people in sympathy with Mike Brown's family, pointing out that Mike Brown was supposed to be going to college and not being funeralized this same day. And another point from one of our questioners you've answered, but I need you to answer it again. In the coverage of the protests in Ferguson, the looters and the riots have been a primary focus. What do you make of this what do you make of this aspect of the events in the coverage anyway, as a longtime resident of this community, and what do you have to say about that? The focus on the looters and the rioters.
Well, I think the coverage, both nationally and locally, the focus on the looting and rioting speaks to that ingrained media bias that perpetuates the narrative that young black men are criminals and dangerous and violent. And so, to me, that it was no shock or surprise that was the case, and that was what folks were focusing on in the media. But again, we want to recognize and lift up the fact that a lot of the folks that were involved in the looting and everything, while we definitely condemn their actions, they, for a large part of them, were not from the Ferguson community. And there are reports that I've heard from folks that have been there on the ground since day one, talking about agitators, outside agitators, both white and black, being brought into the community. One young lady at a protest who was, again, there on the ground, she was actually in town from New York to support Mike Brown, talked about seeing vans and trucks full of white men going around the West Florissant area, the Ferguson area, and actually seeing some of them set up there on West Florissant, handing out Molotov cocktails to some of the young people there, just to agitate the situation. And so we know, and whenever you're having such an emotional community response, that there are always going to be folks who want to take advantage of the situation. And so I think, Ferguson is no different in that way.
Thank you. We have a question from Margaret in Chicago, which is, you mentioned the Freedom School project, which is going to be a pilot in St. Louis, Ferguson. Could you explain a little bit about what the Freedom School pilot is and how it will help the youth work for change in their community?
Well, the Freedom School pilot, so the Freedom School, AFSC's Freedom School, has been going on in Seattle for the past, I think, 12 years. Dustin has been running that program, and the goal of the Freedom School is to really develop youth organizers in the community that will work to address issues of systemic racism in their communities. So talking about the institutions, the education system, the media, the criminal justice system, and how they continue to oppress communities of color. And it's an opportunity for young people to learn the historic roots of where where our communities are today, and also develop and strategize ways where they can work against. And in Seattle, they have what they call Youth Undoing Institutional Racism, and we hope to begin a chapter of that here in St. Louis. Our Freedom School is going to happen a week from Friday. You know, we've had a lot of interest from folks who, I mean, conversations about racism have been going on in the wake of the Mike Brown tragedy. But our goal is not just to have a conversation and give young people this knowledge and this analysis, is to push them out and say, hey, we need to work to undo these institutions that perpetuate violence and oppression against communities of color, specifically young men of color. And so, yeah, that's the goal of the Freedom School, and that's what we hope to do here in St. Louis.
Thank you. We have a question from Liz in Minneapolis. It's a big picture question, so I'm going to hold on to it until we get an answer and get to hear from Lewis Webb in New York. But one part of the question is relevant to you in particular, Joshua. What is going on? What specific steps are happening to address local policing there in St. Louis and/or Ferguson? What specifically is happening to address changing the policing policies that led to this tragedy?
Sure. Well, one of the, I guess, good things that has come out of this tragedy, this horrific event, is the fact that a light is now being shown on these small municipalities who make their money off of the backs of the poor and people of color in these communities. And if you look at Ferguson, for example, 86% of the police stops involved African Americans, despite the fact that only 67% of African Americans live in that community. And if you also look at the Ferguson city budget, the second largest line item from that budget comes from fines and warrants as a result of those traffic stops. And so, I mean, again, this attention has brought a light to what has been going on for a long time to young people and people of color in these communities. And so one of the things that we hope to address is and bring forth is the idea and the process of civilian review and police accountability that we can put in place so that these police departments know that they are not, above the law, and that they should be about serving the community, not just making money off of them. In addition to that, I know there's at least one police department, not there in St. Louis, North St. Louis County, but in West County, the Ellisville Police Department, that voluntarily started implementing a dash cam program, and so that their officers would have them in their vehicles and also on their person. So that, I mean, those are just two steps in the right direction, and I think we just have to keep holding these police departments accountable to that.
Thank you. Very fine, very fine. I have another question from the online, but we do want to hear a little bit from Lewis, so I will hold this question. Thank you, outside audience person. In New York City, where Lewis Webb works, there has been a long tradition of work to correct police behavior that leads to disproportionate impacts on young people of color, from stop and frisk, which is referred to often as traffic stops in other places, to the school-to-prison pipeline that reflects policies that disproportionately impact young people of color. So we're going to talk with Lewis Webb, who is the new Jim Crow Project Coordinator for AFSC. Lewis, the campaign against the school-to-prison pipeline, can you sort of fill us in on what the school-to-prison pipeline is and how policies impact communities of color?
I can certainly do that. What I believe is we have to talk more about the realities that the young people are facing. I could certainly share statistics and numbers, but I just don't think that gets to the root of the problem. It makes it benign almost. What we're looking at is a system that has identified young men of color as less than human, less deserving of the resources that this country has normally made available to people. And one of them is access to education. If you identify a 6-year-old black child as someone who's not worthy of devoting $2-3 million of educational resources to, then you're not concerned about whether or not he makes it through the system. What you are concerned is just what value does he have. And unfortunately, young men of color are may be the most valuable resource in this country, not for their intellect or their abilities, but for their prison value. What we have is a system that has figured out that the most valuable way to handle young men of color is to put them through a system that employs a whole bunch of people and makes a whole bunch of corporations very rich. And we have to find a way to change that dialogue. We've got to change the narrative so that no longer can we identify young men of color as simply chattel, a way to, feed other people's coffers. I'm raising 3 young men of color, and one of them has had some serious challenges in high school, and he's been through a suspension once or twice. And when I talked to him about it, what frightened me more than the suspension is his sense that it's no big deal. It is almost standard operating procedure in his school that people that look like him are subjected to a level of what we call zero tolerance and pushouts that are destined to create more Mike Browns. The school-to-prison pipeline could often be called the school-to-death pipeline, because once you put these young men out of schools and you subject them to the policing that goes on in these communities, then we have what we have in Ferguson. We have young black men who are trained to be afraid, and that fear manifests itself in a number of ways, and the response is often, let's shoot them, because they're not human. They're just not valued the same way as other communities' young people are. So the school to prison. Go ahead.
Lewis, can you get specific about the policies in schools that lead to that reflect the dehumanization and lead to young black people being out of school in the first place?
Oh, the first one is most definitely what we call zero tolerance. Okay. I grew up in the 60s and 70s in the New York City public school system, and I'm sure I acted out a bit. Mom would be able to tell you better than me. But, those things were treated a lot differently than they are now. Now, if a young man does something that is considered inappropriate in school, there's not a dialogue. There's no effort at restorative justice. It's simply, you know what, you're incorrigible, you don't belong here, you're in our way, go to this special school. That special school is usually staffed with someone who really doesn't care or know how to work with young people. So the next step is expulsion. Once you get expulsion, you have a system that has simply said, you know what, out of school, out of mind, welcome to the prison system. We also have this high risk testing. You put a young man who is subjected to the challenges of inner city life, and you ask him to meet the same standards of someone who's benefited from a much more quality level of education, and the results are not unexpected. You get the inability to pass the test, which also results in pushouts. You have the hiring of inexperienced teachers in inner city communities. I mean, I had some teachers who knew how to deal with the people that I was in class with. And then you have teachers today who are so afraid of the young black men of color that as soon as anything happens that suggests any level of misbehavior, nothing even remotely close to criminality, you get school safety involved, which is a branch of the New York Police Department. And you have that police involvement immediately, and the system just continually perpetuates young black men of color belong in the criminal justice system, not in the educational system. So zero tolerance, high risk tests, inexperienced teachings, those are some of the policies and practices that I'm convinced contribute to the school to prison pipeline.
Let's also talk a little bit about the economic impact of the stream of people going into prisons, particularly those run by private corporations, the for-profit prisons. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I certainly can. New York has been, at least I think, lucky because we have a very strong corrections officers union, so we don't have private prisons for the most part in this state, although across the country AFSC has been working in many areas that address issues of privatization. And it's not just in the criminal justice system. We have a major concern in our immigration policies and the way that we subject people coming into this country, documented or undocumented, into a system that is also filled with profit. So, you know, I think recently I read from my immigration colleagues a report that said they are actually deciding how many beds to create based on the numbers of dollars that they can make. So it's just so egregious that human beings, or what we believe are human beings, and others unfortunately don't identify as such, have become nothing more than an economic resource. And so privatization in the prisons is one thing, but it goes well beyond that. In New York State, most of our prisons are in rural upstate communities, communities that really don't have other employment opportunities for the people. I'm terribly sorry about that. And, you know, so it becomes an opportunity for people to get jobs. It becomes an opportunity for construction companies to build prisons. It's just one of the most alarming realities of the prison industrial complex. The realities that tell us money is what drives this. It's not about corrections. It's not about rehabilitation. It's about how much money can we make off these millions of young black men.
Thank you, Lewis. I'm going to get a question in now from audience member that wants to know from Joshua first, what has been the reaction from the peer mediators at the school where you have been working? Joshua, since school just started yesterday, I'm sure that's a hard one to answer, but based on your experience last year, what are the peer mediators talking about in response to this?
Well, I think the response of the peer mediators is no different than the response of a lot of young people here. There's a lot of anger and frustration, and as Lewis was talking about, this has brought to the surface a lot of the feelings of being treated less than human in our communities and in our schools. And so their response is obviously, like I said, anger and frustration and a desire to change that narrative. We had a listening session for a group of about 25 young men last week at one of the schools that we work in. And it was just a listening session where they had an opportunity to share their experience with the police, their feelings about what happened with Mike Brown, and it was an opportunity for the three adults in the room to just sit back and listen. And so there was a lot of anger and frustration, and obviously justifiable when they talked about their feeling like, based on the color of their skin, walking down the street, they're being treated as a suspect. And one of the things that we did following that conversation was to ask, how can the adults in your school, in your home, in your community, and in the government work to make things better, to relieve some of this frustration? And one comment from one young man stood out to me, where he put in each of those areas, being black is not a crime, being black is not a crime, being black is not a crime, being black is not a crime. And so, I think a lot of the young people are carrying around that sense that just based on the color of their skin, they are automatically viewed as criminals. Some of the young men talked about not wanting to be seen with too many other young men of color because that would appear suspicious, or as if they didn't want to congregate in too large of a group because that was seen as dangerous, and as if they were up to no good. And so I think we've got to listen to those voices when they bring issues like that up, and really deal with some of the prejudices that are ingrained in our society in regards to young black men.
Thank you. I'm going to shift a little bit. Ferguson has become about a lot more than the shooting of Mike Brown. One of the reasons we're responding by having this hangout is because we have had our constituents, our AFSC fans and followers, ask us questions about this. Here's a question from Wes. I'm a Quaker minister whose meeting is in a predominantly working class white community, although it is being rapidly suburbanized. I'm really wanting to address Ferguson and issues of race and policing from a faith perspective. What are some helpful inroads and approaches you see being helpful in a community like mine? What are some helpful approaches you see being helpful in a community like his?
Okay. The first thing I would say is just to continue having these dialogues and conversations. Here in St. Louis, there's been this long history of segregation. Missouri was a slave state, but technically in the North, I guess, and we had more Union soldiers than Confederate, and so there's this long history of segregation and racist policy that have led to things being the way they look today. And I mean, whereas I think in some other communities, you've been forced to have conversations due to riots there at the turn of the century or during the 60s and 70s, but we didn't have that here in St. Louis. There was a race riot in East St. Louis in 1916, but for a large part, we haven't had to have these conversations. And so I think the first step is acknowledging that there is a problem, and we need to talk about it. I would recommend he seek out some help from the Freedom School, because I think Dustin and the way they set up in partnership with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond is we can have these conversations about what racism is. Really, it's not just these person-to-person interactions, but it's really about how systems were set up to benefit one group over the other. And I think we've got to be honest about where things are here in the United States. So I think the first step is just having that open and honest conversations.
Thank you.
And I guess the faith piece is just to come to the conversations with humility, because I think, that's all I'm going to say.
Thank you. Lewis, you are in New York. Is there a resource that this minister, Quaker minister, could use to help him guide conversations about race and policing?
Oh, there are a bunch of them. I think I would certainly start with the work that's being done throughout all communities with the new Jim Crow issue. When we look back at the civil rights movement of the 60s, there's no doubt that the Quakers' voice was a powerful one. And, repeating that, improving that is certainly an inroad that I think would be very beneficial. We also have to acknowledge that the Quakers are challenged with their race composition, and we kind of open up a bit. We've got to engage communities that don't normally engage with us, and we've got to bear witness. Quakers might not, as a community, experience some of the challenges of young men of color, but you can certainly bear witness to it. You can certainly speak to it. You can certainly stand with. I've come a big fan of the word accompaniment. Stand with us. Let your presence be part of ours, and I promise you that you will get the inroads. Communities of color are extremely welcoming communities. Just come to us, talk to us, engage with us, but be honest. Talk about your fears, talk about your prejudices, and I promise you, with the strength of faith, we will find commonality and an amazing opportunity to improve what needs to be improved before it's just too damn late.
Thank you very much, Lewis. You should also know, those participating in the chat, if you go to afsc.org/friends, our Friends Relations Director, Lucy Duncan, will publish a blog post this week on anti-racism as a spiritual practice, which is going to be interesting, I can tell you that. If you have not read Acting in Faith, you need to start this week. We have another question, this one from Minneapolis. This one back to you, Joshua. Do you see any shifts in the part of the people who hold power in Missouri? I assume that person means the district attorney or the police chief or the mayor or the governor, to re-examine their policies and practices. Any evidence? We've talked about shifts in young people. Joshua, have you seen any evidence of the people in power are considering re-examining their practices?
I mean, I've heard some of the things that have come out from St. Louis City Police Chief Sam Dotson. He's talking about beefing up the civilian review board, but I haven't really seen anything from these smaller municipalities again, where the majority of the population are people of color, but the political power and economic power rests in the small minority of whites who live there. And so I think again that our charge in the wake of this tragedy is to continue to hold these elected officials accountable, even after all the cameras are gone. And that takes people getting out there and voting. And this past election cycle, the mayor of Ferguson ran unopposed. The city council has one African American. The Ferguson Florissant School Board, there are no people of color on the school board. And so it's going to take us actually grabbing hold and really, getting out there and voting and getting our voice, uplifting our own voice for them to make some substantive changes. And so I think my hope, again, as in the wake of this tragedy, is that we will continue to do that and uplift the people of color in these communities.
Thank you, Joshua. Let me just point out a couple of facts. It's hard to register to vote if you have a criminal record of any kind. And so the school-to-prison pipeline that puts so many young men of color in jail also takes away their right to vote in most places. So the disproportionate, unreflective power structure is one more consequence of the school-to-prison pipeline. We have, as we've all noted, this is a national conversation. We have a question from someone. Tom from Los Angeles says, there has been reports by the Pew, the Washington Post, and Chicago Sun-Times that public school segregation is reemerging. This is not new to most of us, but it's been documented now. So the question is, how can we best address this fundamental failing, that schools are being resegregated? I'm going to ask Lewis to take a crack at that one.
I think your point, Alexis, that this is not new to most of us is a valid one. We see it in New York. The report clearly said New York was probably the most segregated school system in the country. And, who's surprised? The reality is that that's what's destined. That's what the new Jim Crow is all about. It's returning to a system that has identified a group of people as not being worthy. So yeah, let's put in any mechanism possible to separate them from our worthy kids. What do? Therein lies the real challenge. And unfortunately, an answer today might not be the best, but what we do is we acknowledge it. We look at it, we talk about it, but we don't just look at the numbers. We look at the impact on our young people. Is this really what we want? Do we really want a society that has figured out a way to once again create a segregated educational system? Have we not learned anything since the 1950s? And if the answer is, you know what, that's what we want, then a major change has to happen, and how that's going to look, I'm a little afraid of, to tell you the truth. But right now it's about acknowledging it and not pretending that it's it's an overzealous reporter or a misguided report. It's the reality that the young men that I am raising and the young men that we work with throughout the country are seeing. They are continuing to be separated. So you separate them in schools, and then you separate them in prisons. So, let's talk about it. Let's open that dialogue. Let's not be afraid to be ashamed of ourselves, and to really start having an honest conversation as who we are and how do we treat everyone. Citizenship is not the only standard for fairness. So it's about humanity. And right now, I think segregation needs to be at the forefront of our conversations again. I think you're muted, Alexis.
Sorry, thank you. Good catch. The militarization of police departments has finally been brought to the forefront following the Ferguson protests. The question is, this is a critique that's also been made of border communities, specifically the U.S.-Mexico border, where police brutality of one form or another has ended the lives of both immigrants and non-immigrants. Is there a collaborative opportunity that either of you see in bringing communities of color together around these shared experiences and hopefully shared solutions? I'll let Lewis take the first.
That's a great question, one that we have been talking about within AFSC for some time now. I just got back from San Francisco, where that certainly was part of the conversation. And the answer is certainly. There is not only an opportunity, but I believe a need for a collaborative conversation and way forward between communities of color, regardless of their immigration status. You know, when you face an AK-47, it doesn't matter what side of a border you're on. It doesn't matter how dark or not dark your skin is or what language you speak. The fear is the fear. And when we talk about militarization of the police and all of its manifestations, the one that I think is most frustrating for me is that this equipment, these uniforms, these things, they prevent dialogue. You know, how do you talk to someone when you're looking at a shielded helmet? You know, and so they're not bulletproof, they're conversation-proof equipment. And we all know that dialogue is really the only opportunity we have to fix this. I mean, wars just don't work. And, you know, we have a war on drugs, we have a war on crime. Sure, that's the dialogue that is pervasive in today's society. And sure, if you're at war, why not be militarized? So we've got to change the dialogue, and the only opportunity for that is conversation. And conversation doesn't happen if it's between a shield and a mask.
Thank you. Joshua, what do you think about collaborative abilities going forward for communities on the border, immigrants and non-immigrants?
I mean, I definitely see that there are opportunities and connections that could be made, and AFSC is absolutely in a unique position to do that with what's going on here in St. Louis, and you know, in the offices that operate here domestically, there's definitely an opportunity to collaborate and bring these shared experiences into a national conversation. And so, yeah, I'm all for and looking for ways to collaborate in that way.
One follow-up question: how did the residents feel and respond to that use of military equipment there in Ferguson?
I think there was some shock. I think you had some folks who, there in Ferguson, who just wanted it to go away. I mean, I saw reports that you know, folks wanted to sleep at night. It was it was keeping them up and their kids up. But at the same time, you had people who were just fed up with the continued marginalization of their community and their voice, and so they were out there every night, engaged in peaceful protest of what the police were doing, and thankfully that brought to light some of the practices that have gone on that led to police having these military weapons and these vehicles. It brought enough light to them so that, and enough negative attention so that there was actually a withdrawal over this last week of those tactics.
Thank you. There are those who say they should never have been employed in the first place, because the state police, who were in charge until the night before the National Guard was called out, had apparently used what they call community policing by walking and talking with the residents, and things were calm. But then when the National Guard came, equipped in all that military gear, that things erupted one more time. We have a...
Interject there. You're right in saying that there had been some calm restored. But then again, the Ferguson police chief, who were calling for his resignation, ignited strong emotions when he released, the same day he released Officer Wilson's name, also released those photos of Mike Brown. And the implication for me was clear. They were saying that this shooting was justified, and even though he didn't say it, the implication was clear. So that, I mean, that's part of the reason that the National Guard was brought out.
Very good point. I would also point out that the media has, for the past 20 years at least, followed a narrative where a white killer is described more positively than a black victim, in much the same way with Mike Brown. Whether or not he stole a pack of gum or a soda, whether or not he was even in the convenience store that film was released of, the media response has been, once again, demonize the victim and make an excuse for the alleged killer. We have a couple more questions. From one of our listeners out there, they want to know the racial and gender composition of the City Council of Ferguson. Actually, I think we answered that. The mayor, the police chief, 90% of the police force, and the majority of City Council in Ferguson is white, but I don't know about the gender piece.
I could be wrong. I don't have the website up in front of me, but I believe the City Council is composed of 5 members, 1 African American. I think if I'm remembering correctly, there are 3 men serving and 1 woman. I could be wrong about that, but
that's okay. We'll follow up with that caller to make sure we have the right information. Okay. Sorry. I have another question up here. This one from Minneapolis. In addition to addressing the federal issues that have allowed for the militarization of police departments around the country, what specific and strategic sequence of steps do we recommend that we pursue with local police departments? Who should we ask to speak with? What should we ask to happen? How do we keep the pressure on for meaningful follow-through? Tough questions, but my understanding is, first, as you guys have said, the first is to find a civilian review board. Is that Lewis, you want to take that first, police civilian review board, or is there something else that ought to happen?
As a New Yorker, I'm not a big fan of civilian review boards. They really don't amount to much here in New York City. But, you know, if the community that you're in has one that has some ability, then certainly it is a tool. I am convinced that the conversation has to start not with police departments or with legislation or any other policy-generated effort. I think we need to talk to the police officers. One of the things that you often hear from police officers is that policing your own people is not easy. And I'm certain that if we were to poll 100 police officers in any part of this country, and including New York City, they would not be comfortable with having that level of engagement with their own communities. Now, certainly there is argument around, well, police don't come from the communities that they police, and that is certainly an issue that contributes to the problem. But at the end of the day, there's a national sense of, you know, we're all Americans, even though people of color don't tend to be treated as such in many avenues. But I think we really need to start talking to the police officers that are being asked to use and wear this equipment. And I would not be surprised if less of them would say, you know what, this is not what I signed up for. And if we can start getting that type of dialogue going, and we engage the people that are living in the communities that are subjected to this, I wouldn't be surprised if we'd see some of the policy changes from the bottom up. You know, I'm not a big fan of starting at the top because they're not on the ground. They're not living this experience. So I certainly encourage a conversation with not just your departments, but the police officer in your community, and let his or her voice be heard. And you know, if it turns out that that's what they want, then we have to start looking at policy and legislation and review boards. But I really want to hear what the police officers feel about having this level of weaponry and this level of disconnect in their communities that militarization causes.
Thank you. Joshua, you have a response?
Just to follow up on what Lewis has said, I would agree that we need to build connections and relationships. The police need to do that with the community and build those and make those stronger ties. We're actually, again, in the wake of the Mike Brown tragedy, our office is trying to organize that dialogue with some of the youth that have been working with at Northwest and McClure. There's a local Quaker who is on our program committee who is connected, has a longtime family friend who's a police officer. He's actually come out to our meetings before, and I think he would be a great bridge to begin having those conversations with. And I think he's definitely of the mindset that a lot that happens on the police department, and he'll tell you this in candid conversations, a lot that happens in the police department doesn't need to occur, and he's frustrated himself. And so I think we have an opportunity here to begin that dialogue and really, as an organization, be a bridge between the community and the police there.
Thank you. We have another question for you, Joshua. How long do you think it will take for there to be trust between the residents of Ferguson and the law enforcement authorities? Do you see any chance of this happening at all from the youth and the people you spoke with?
I mean, I think it's going to take a long time. It's going to take a long time, but that's okay. I would say that it doesn't just begin with the police kind of doing a better job of community relations. We need to talk about these municipal courts that, again, make their money off of the backs of the poor and people of color in the community, and how we can bring relief. Because, I mean, those systems that are there in those municipalities, and I've experienced them myself firsthand. I'm gonna be honest here. I've only been pulled over in St. Louis City once in my life. The 5 other times that I've been pulled over have been in these small municipalities where they're trying to catch you, and they're targeting young people of color to make money. So I think we can have the community relations from the police department, but we also need to address some of these systems that, again, generate revenue off of targeting and oppressing people of color in these communities. So I think, in answer to the question, it's going to take some time, but I think we can't just look at police and community relations. We got to look at the big picture of what's going on in these communities.
Thank you. We have an interesting question. The time is getting short, believe it or not. Just to reassure you who are sending questions in, we will be getting back to you with answers as soon as we can if we don't get to it during this hangout. One question is from Tom. A black mother that I know teaches her 12-year-old son that racism is a form of mental illness. Is this useful, and can we get professional recognition of this dialogue? It just so happens I know the second part of the question answer because I used to work for a healthcare system. For quite a few years, there have been attempts to get racism defined as a form of a mental illness by physicians. It is not really come close to discussion, but there is an effort by mental health professionals to get racism defined as a form of mental illness. Joshua and/or Lewis, what do you think? Would that be useful, helpful, what?
She said Joshua first, Joss.
Lewis, I'm going to let you speak to the mental health aspect of it, but I would just say, you know, having gone through the Freedom School, one of the first things that we do is come to a collective and just a basic understanding of what racism is and how it plays out in our society. And I think that's one of the problems that we have here in the United States, is that for a large segment of our population, we think that racism is putting on a hood and a white cloak, or shaving your head and committing acts of violence against people of color. But it's more than those acts of violence. It's about the systems that have been set up, again, to benefit one group of people over another, and how you can trace that history back to the founding of this country. And so, again, just to give a plug for the Freedom School, that's one of the things that we're going to unpack at the Freedom School, to give young people that analysis of what racism really is, and that understanding, so that they can go out and really work against it.
Thank you. Okay, Lewis.
All right. You know, on some level, I guess my answer is, if there's a treatment, then yeah, let's identify it as a mental illness and, you know, start using the treatment that's available to fix it. I'm afraid, however, that it's not going to be that simple. And as I was thinking about the question, thanks, Josh, for giving me time for that, I thought about the defense that was used not too long ago called altruism. No, that's not what it was called. It was a defense that said, I'm just too rich to know right from wrong.
Oh, affluenza.
Affluenza, right? I'm getting my issues mixed up. Yeah, so you know what? When we kind of start finding excuses for realities, then I think we run into a problem. Racism on the individual level may be helped with a conversation, but what do we do with structural racism? What do we do with the bigger racism issues? Are we going to start identifying cultures as having mental illnesses? And you know, I'm not real comfortable with that approach. I think that we just have to talk about racism as we understand it now, and as we continue to try to address it, which I think has been the real problem. We haven't really had an honest conversation about it in a very long time. It's been one of those things we've tried to bury under the carpet. And you know, it's Mike Brown and the other Mike Browns across this country may have given us that opportunity, and I think maybe that obligation, to start talking about it. And if it turns out that there are mental health issues contributing to it, then yeah, let's look at treatment and other methods that can alleviate it. But we've really got to start trying to understand it again. You know, we thought we addressed it well in the 60s and 70s, but guess what? It's still here, and it's showing itself in ways that that are destroying young black men. And so it's time to talk. Okay.
Oh yeah, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Yeah, you make a good point that was made at the service from Mike Brown, that he would not want to be remembered as causing riots, but as causing a change in policing, a change in policy, not simply in response to one tragedy. We're coming up close on time. I will answer this question from a Quaker in St. Louis. Are there opportunities to engage in boycott and divestment campaigns against companies profiting from both the prison system and the militarization of police? We have a boycott and divestment campaign right now at AFSC.org against companies that are supporting the the continued oppression of Palestinian people. I don't think that we have one specifically against companies profiting from prisons, but that's an interesting question I'll research and follow up with later. I see it's almost time to get us out of here. You've been listening to Lewis Webb, AFSC's New York project coordinator for the New Jim Crow Project, and Joshua Webb, AFSC's Peace Education Director in St. Louis, both of whom have been working on these issues for quite a while. If you have any further questions, please keep sending them to questions@afsc.org. Thank you for your time and attention, everybody. This has been a very interesting conversation, taking us on paths I didn't expect.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.